Among the many possible tools to fight climate change, one that comes up occasionally is dealing with overpopulation. But is overpopulation actually a problem? And if so, does combating it help us deal with climate change? People have been worrying for a very long time that too many mouths to feed would inevitably lead to a dystopian future. In 1798, Thomas Malthus published an essay on the principle of population, where he stated his belief that populations grew until the poor were so hungry that societies became unstable and populations would shrink. In 1968, Paul Ehrlich published The Population Bomb, introducing Malthusian economics to a new generation. Since that time, the environmental movement has been focused on population and how we're consuming too much of Earth's resources to be sustainable. According to one study, we're consuming 1.7 Earths worth of resources, suggesting that the population either needs to consume fewer resources per person or have fewer people, since getting another planet isn't an option anytime soon, regardless of what Musk and Bezos tell us. But in the context of climate change, should we be focusing on population? Is population growth making decarbonization more difficult? The best way to lower the birth rate is increase the standard of living. This is so effective that the birth rate in most developed countries is so low that populations are shrinking or soon will be. As we see here, since the publication of the population bomb, fertility, which is the number of children per woman, has been dropping quickly. If it's below 2.1, then populations will decrease. Outside of Africa, the fertility rate is below the replacement level in every region. So outside of Africa, growing populations is not the problem, shrinking populations are. In fact, many industrialized countries are instituting policies to increase the birth rate, hoping to avoid the demographic bomb that my fellow YouTuber Peter Zion talks so much about. And though I often disagree with his videos on energy and technology, on demographics, I think he's got a good point, though he doesn't talk enough about immigration. The world's population is still growing, though slowly. It's just mostly happening in Africa. So are growing populations in Africa, the only place they're growing significantly, a problem? The metric I'm using for greenhouse gas emissions corrects for trade. For instance, if Japan builds a car and exports it to the US, the emissions from building that car count in the US total, not Japan's. And looking at emissions across the world, Africa's per capita greenhouse gas emissions are by far the lowest, about 20% of the world average. So if not population, what is the problem? Here we see the relationship between daily average median income, which is a reasonable metric for how rich the citizens of a country are, and the average per capita emissions, correcting for trade. We see a pretty strong correlation between wealth and greenhouse gas emissions. In other words, rich countries pollute more per capita than poor countries. This is the least surprising thing ever. So the obvious solution is we should all be poor. The worst thing we could do is enact policies that improve the standard of living in poor countries, because then they'll emit just as much pollution as those in the global north. Obviously, that's not the answer. We need to focus on decarbonizing the wealthy countries and build an energy infrastructure in the global south that is zero carbon from the start. This is like how landlines are still rare in the global south, but cell phones are common. They skipped a generation of technology. People living in the global south often suffer from energy poverty, which leads to a whole host of problems. We who have benefited from the old system have to support building a new system in Africa and elsewhere that meets their needs while supporting the energy transition. Since the poor suffer disproportionately from the changing climate, it doesn't help anyone to build coal and gas plants anywhere, including places suffering from energy poverty. So, in short, overpopulation is no longer a thing, and reducing the birth rate is not a solution to climate change. We need to decarbonize the global north and build an energy system for the global south that meets their needs without adding to the problem. If you've learned something, please like and subscribe. And you can support the channel by buying me a coffee. And please share this video with anyone you know who has had less than 2.1 kids.